Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping straight into, well, understanding how society slaps labels on actions and people.
And the consequences, right? What
Yeah,
happens because of those labels?
exactly. We've got some interesting source material here, excerpts looking at social reaction theory and social conflict theory, specifically around delinquency.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal really is to get a better handle on how these labels get applied, why it matters maybe more than you'd think.
And just get you thinking critically about these social processes. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
Mm.
So, to ground this, let's talk about a real-world example from our sources. Jaden Simmons,
Okay.
youngest of 6, grew up in a pretty tough neighborhood.
Right.
By 11, lots of school absences, staying out late.
Started shoplifting too, I recall.
Yeah. And then things got even tougher. His parents lost their jobs during the COVID lockdowns, housing struggles.
Which led to him going into foster care.
Right.
Right. Voluntarily.
Correct. But even with that support, the delinquent behavior, well, it didn't just stop overnight.
No, there's still issues. Disorderly conduct, fights.
But here's the interesting part. People saw potential in him.
Yeah.
Said he was engaging, a talented athlete,
That potential piece is key, I think.
definitely. And eventually, with a lot of work from foster parents, DSS, coaches, even this accountability group,
Mm-hmm.
he made a real turnaround.
Stayed out of trouble, got that college scholarship. It's quite the story arc presented in the sources.
It absolutely is. And it makes you ask, is that kind of turnaround realistic,
Mm-hmm.
common even?
Or is it more the exception?
Right. And it really puts a spotlight on how we react to those early mistakes.
Yeah.
Does that reaction have, serious long-term consequences?
Is the reaction more important than what caused the behavior initially? That's a huge question.
Yeah. Was Jaden's behavior just baked in? Was he born like that, or was it made, shaped by his experiences and how people treated him?
And these are exactly the kinds of questions that social reaction theory tries to get at.
Often called labeling theory, right?
That's the one,
All right.
labeling theory.
Okay, so let's unpack this labeling theory. What's the core idea?
Well, basically, it argues that deciding to label something as deviant or delinquent, it's subjective.
Subjective how?
It depends on the observer, their attitudes, their values, their morals. So the theory suggests an act isn't inherently, bad,
Until someone calls it bad.
pretty much, until it gets labeled that way by others, by society.
That sounds radical, almost.
Yeah.
Are we saying murder isn't actually bad unless we label it? That seems counterintuitive.
It's a strong claim, for sure. The theory argues that even acts we almost all agree are terrible, murder, rape, assault, their badness is tied to that societal labeling.
The social condemnation creates the deviance, in a sense.
That's the theoretical perspective, yes. It emphasizes the social process of defining deviance.
But surely there's a difference between, shoplifting and murder, regardless of labels.
The theory doesn't deny harm exists, but it focuses on how the meaning and the consequences attached to acts are built socially.
Through labeling.
Precisely. Our sources even point out nuances in serious crimes. Think about forcible rape versus consensual sex.
Okay.
The line often comes down to interpretation, right? What a jury believes, how they label the events based on the evidence and perspective presented.
So interpretation is key. How does that actually work? The sources mention symbolic interaction.
Right. Symbolic interaction is kind of the foundation here. It's the idea that we communicate using symbols.
Like words, gestures.
Exactly. Gestures, signs, words, images, things that represent something else. A wedding ring, for instance.
Represents marriage, commitment.
Or maybe career advancement, depending on context. Or think of a Rolex, symbol of success, wealth.
Or maybe it's just a fake.
Exactly. Symbols are interpreted, and we're constantly doing this interpretation in our interactions.
Like reading signals from people.
Yeah. Someone shrugs, do they not care, or just not know? You interpret that symbol, and these interpretations, the reactions we get.
They shape how we see ourselves.
They can, yes. A good grade is a symbol from a teacher saying, you're smart, or you worked hard. That boosts your self-perception.
So if someone gets labeled a troublemaker,
That label becomes a powerful symbol. It carries meaning, and how others react to that symbol influences the person. It can become a kind of feedback loop.
people react based on the label. The person interprets that reaction. It affects their self-image, maybe influences future actions.
You've got it. Labeling theory essentially says there isn't some purely objective reality for deviance. It's about interpreted reactions giving meaning to actions, and
Yeah.
meanings can change.
The sources brought up the Kyle Rittenhouse case here, didn't they?
Yes, as a stark example of subjective interpretation. He shot people during protests.
Huge controversy over whether it was self-defense or illegal violence.
Exactly. The label applied self-defense or murder depended entirely on the interpretation of his actions in that specific context. The jury interpreted it one way, leading to acquittal.
Another interpretation could have meant conviction. It really drives home the power of perspective and labeling. Now, the sources also discuss social conflict theory, critical theory sometimes.
Right. Similar focus on decision makers, but with well, the sources call it a political twist.
Okay, what's the twist?
The core idea is that the law and the labeling process fundamentally serves the capitalist system. It protects the interests of the economically powerful.
So it's less about general morals and values and more about money and power.
That's the argument. Social conflict theory suggests people get arrested, judged, punished, based partly, maybe largely, on their social class,
Not just the crime itself.
but also whether they're perceived as a threat to the existing economic and social order.
Okay, so let me see if I get the difference. Labeling theory focuses on the beliefs and values of those in power shaping labels, while conflict theory emphasizes their economic and political interest driving the labels.
That's a good way to put it. It shifts the focus from values to interests, in a sense.
But they seem to agree on something important.
They do. Both theories really highlight that social and economic status heavily influences how you're treated.
Whether you're seen as like a dangerous outsider versus an insider who just messed up.
Exactly. And that perception, shaped by these labels and influenced by status, can determine your whole future path, according to these perspectives. How you're viewed matters more than why you did it, sometimes.
Which inevitably brings us back to Jaden Simmons.
Right.
So, looking at his story through that social reaction lens, how might that initial delinquent label after the shoplifting and absences had impacted things?
Well, it could easily have set expectations, couldn't it? From teachers, maybe law enforcement, maybe even from Jaden himself.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone treats you like a delinquent.
It can become harder not to be one. It can shape your identity. But Jaden's story, as presented, also shows the flip side.
The positive reactions.
Yes. The support from foster parents, coaches, the DSS, that accountability group, they actively worked against a purely negative label,
They didn't just define him by his past mistakes.
which likely played a massive role in his turnaround. It shows that positive interactions, positive labels in a way, can counteract the negative ones.
And what about social conflict theory? Any insights there for Jaden?
Well, you could look at his starting point, growing up in poverty, his parents' economic hardship during the pandemic.
The lack of consistent support initially.
Right. Conflict theory might ask. Did his socioeconomic background make him more likely to be negatively labeled early on? Were the initial responses or lack thereof tied to his family's position in the social structure?
It makes you think about resources and who gets support versus who gets processed by the system.
Definitely. It adds that layer of economic and social structure to the labeling process.
But ultimately, Jaden's story, at least as it's told here, really seems to highlight the power of those positive interactions and support systems.
Absolutely. It suggests that those things were crucial in helping him shift paths.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that how society reacts, how we react to someone's missteps can have these huge, long-lasting effects.
It can either help lock someone into a negative trajectory or potentially provide the off-ramp they need.
So wrapping this up, we've explored social reaction theory, this idea of subjective labeling.
And social conflict theory, adding that critical perspective on power and economic influence.
And the big takeaway seems to be, well, how society reacts really, really matters. It's not just a passive response. It actively shapes outcomes.
The label itself has power. It can change a person's life, for better or worse.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to chew on. Considering these theories, considering Jaden, how much does the label itself push someone towards continuing or stopping deviant behavior?
Yeah, how much weight does that tag actually carry?
And flowing from that,
Yeah.
what responsibility does society have, not just in applying labels, but in understanding their impact and maybe trying to foster more positive outcomes?
It's a complex question with no easy answers. Definitely something worth mulling over.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.